Hello, I'm Barbara Page, Barbara Rudder Page. We hope you will get some information out of this video for all the family later on, and I'll tell as many things as I can think of about our family. In 1912, my mother's family, my grandfather, my mother's father, was the youngest son, and in England, the youngest son doesn't get very much in the way of inheritance. And so they didn't have a lot of money, so they decided they might come to America. That was from England. So they read that gold grew on trees in Florida, oranges. And so they looked into it, and they booked passage on the Titanic and found that they couldn't sell enough things to pay for the Titanic, and so they went the month before on the Celtic. And so they came in 1912 and came to Florida. And they went to Arcadia, Florida, which was nothing, just a little cowboy town at that time. And so they moved there, and later on they had some British people in the service who came there for training at their airport, and so they got to know them, and they made a tennis court in their front yard, so they would come over there and play tennis with them. So they had lots of good company, English company. And so then in the 20s, my mother decided to go back to England to visit. And so she went in I don't know, 1926 or so maybe. And she went back to England and stayed there for a while visiting relatives. And then she came back on a ship, and she met my father on the trip. My father had been in World War I and had been in the British RAF, Royal Air Force. And his plane had been shot down over France during World War I, and he had been left for dead, and the Germans came and took all his equipment and anything he had, left him for dead. And then the Red Cross found him, and they rescued him, and he did lose his leg, but he was all right other than that. And so he was being sent over to Peru on this ship by the British Museum of Natural History to find new species in Peru. So my mother was on the same ship as he was, and that's where they became acquainted. And then my father, after he'd been in Peru, he sent her a lot of letters, some in Spanish from Peru, and then he came back up to America, back up to Florida, after he was through with his time in Peru. And then they were married, and they lived in DeLand. I think he must have had a job in DeLand. He was an abstractor. And so they lived in DeLand, where my brother was born in 1927, December 27th, I think, of 1927. And so then later, I was born in DeLand also, in January 1st, 1932. And so I was the first baby born in DeLand that year, obviously, practically. And so that's where I grew up, in DeLand. And my brother was 4 years older than I was. Of course, I always used to ride my bicycle to school, and used to go with a friend, stop at her house on the way, and we'd ride our bicycles together. And later in high school, my father was into hunting very much, hunting and fishing. And so he had a Model A Ford. And so I remember going with him out, and he would put the bird dogs in the rumble seat and shut down the rumble seat, the two bird dogs back there, when he'd go hunting. We always had good quail and all kinds of things, good fish, mostly hunting. And so later, when he'd stopped hunting later on, he became rather ill and actually passed on when he was only 56, I think. He was born in 1899. My mother was born in 1894. And so when I became old enough to drive, I learned to drive in that Model A Ford, and then I fixed it up. I had new seats, plaid seat covers made for the car, made for the seats, and that's what I drove to high school. All through high school, I had my Model A Ford. I used to pick up my friend on the way, Carmen Ann, and but I had a lot of friends. I was in the band from the 7th grade through the 9th grade, playing the clarinet. That was very interesting. We had a wonderful, well, we didn't think so at the time, but a wonderful band director, very strict, we really learned a lot about rhythm and things like that. And of course, I'd learned to play tennis as a child with my mother teaching me. And so I played tennis at different times with friends. In 1943, well, earlier than that, my father kept hearing on British BBC radio that they needed every able Britisher from around the globe to come back to England during World War II and help them with the war. So he went back in early 1953 to England, where he, of course, got to see all his mother and his sister and all his family again. And he was there for the rest of the war. And also later in 1943, in August 9th of 1943, my mother and I had gone to the mountains with my aunt and uncle. Every summer we went up to the North Georgia mountains to be with them. And that August, or late July, we got a telegram saying that my brother was very ill and he was in the hospital. So my mother and I quickly got on a train and went back to DeLand. And he was in the hospital 16 days. He'd been staying with his friend Billy Dolph McDonald, and he'd had a ruptured appendix. It was turned inside, so he didn't feel it until it had broken. And so he was in very bad shape. My mother was with him constantly. I was with friends, staying with friends at the night, and then he passed on August 9th of 1943. It was very hard on my mother, as you can imagine, and my father also not being there at all, being in England. So, I grew up in DeLand. I went to DeLand High School, all the DeLand schools, DeLand Wisconsin Avenue and the junior high, and then the DeLand High. And then my first year of college, I went to Florida State University in Tallahassee. But it was such a huge school, and there were so many people, and the classes were huge. I decided to not go back after that first year. So I went to Stetson University after that. I graduated from there with a degree in education. While I was in college, I'd been dating Malcolm Dykes since high school. While I was in college in late March of 1953, I graduated in 1953. Late March of 1953, Malcolm and I were married because he was being sent to New York City nearby, and we could, if he were there, I could go up and join him, and we could do everything in New York City if we were married. So we were, and we had a great time in New York City. We spent 6 weeks going to everything there was in New York City. And then we were married in 53. In 1954, September, Debbie was born, and we were at the Air Force Base. He was in the Air Force. We were on the Air Force Base in Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, Panhandle. So she was born then, and then that was in September. Then on December 27th, my brother's birthday, Malcolm suddenly became very ill while we were home, and he went to the hospital, our Air Force hospital in Orlando. He was there for a month. Then they sent him up to Boston. We were there for a year and a half or more. But he was very disabled as a result of that. In 1957, we had another child, Jennifer, born in September. And then later in 1960, Joanne was born. In 1962, Daryl. So I was glad to have all four of them, very glad. Jennifer went to Principia College, and that was up in St. Louis. And then later, Drew Ann went to Furman University in South Carolina. When she was going to go there, she had already been chosen to be a baton twirler because she was very good at that in high school. So we decided to go up early to our mountain house in Black Mountain, and she could practice twirling her baton while we were there. So just above our mountain house, up the mountain, was the YMCA, and nobody was there at that time of year. It was September. And but she would go up there every morning and practice on their grounds. They had a big area where she could practice. So one day, after she left, I got very worried about her. And I was just praying to know that she was safe And all of a sudden she came back and she said, I can't believe it. She said, I forgot my batons. I never do that. So I said, wait, I'm going with you. So I went up there with her, and while I was studying my Bible lesson while I was sitting in the car waiting for her twirling, and pretty soon a truck parked behind us. And this man got out and he was watching her on this playground where she was twirling, watching her, and then walking down the mountain slowly toward her. And I just was praying to know that God was right there with us. And so when he got to our car, he looked over and he saw me there. I looked at him and he looked at me. I was not afraid at all. I just knew God was right there. And so after a while, he looked at her and he looked at me. He finally, after a long time, turned around, went back up in his truck and drove away. So I was so thankful that we were guided to be protected by God that day, because I don't think it would have been very good for her otherwise. Very grateful for that. Never forgotten how that worked out. My grandmother had found Christian Science in England before they ever left in 1912. And she had started practicing. They were all going to the Church of England, which is the Episcopal Church in America. And so they all went to the Church of England, or the Episcopal Church, when they came over here. And then that's where I went as a very young child. And then my mother was told that she had a tumor, and it had to be removed very urgently. So she thought about it. She hadn't really ever gone into Christian Science. She got our textbook, which is the explanation of how you can pray with the Bible. And she got the textbook out and studied it all week. She'd gone to the doctor on Friday. She studied it all weekend, and Monday she went back. Doctor said, there's no problem, you're fine. So that made us realize that there was, you could pray and be healed the way Christian Science teaches. So we started going to that church then, she and I. So I was very grateful for that, very grateful for her healing, and many others that we've all had along the way. In the 1960, around that time, I went back to Stetson and got my master's degree at Stetson. Then after we were there for a while, we finally got released from there. We had to have some reason to get out of the hospital for him. So, and I lived in an apartment not too far away with Debbie. And so we found his mother had a toy shop in DeLand. So what we did is we decided to open one with her help in New Smyrna Beach. So we had a reason to leave the hospital. That's what we did. We did that for a short time. It was not very good, because I think at that time I became pregnant with Jennifer. We decided we'd move back to DeLand, and so we just lived there for a few months. I taught at Eglin Air Force Base when we first went there, and then I guess I had, well, Malcolm became ill. I couldn't do any more then, and then I had Jennifer later, and 3 years later, and then I didn't teach again for a while, but I ended up teaching again at George Marks School in DeLand, and teaching. I taught 3rd grade at Eglin Air Force Base. I taught 4th grade at George Marks, and taught that for a while, and so then later on I taught again. And after I got my master's degree, I was a school psychologist instead of a teacher, and I went around to 12 different schools testing children who needed help. Well, I forgot to say that while I was at Stetson, I decided to go out for cheerleading. They had a football team at that time until 1956, and I graduated in 53. So I decided to go out for cheerleading, and I became the head cheerleader. There were 2 of us at first year, and then I was the head cheerleader after that. So we had some wonderful times cheering for the football team and the basketball team and everything else. We had a very good time doing that. Oh, later on, in 1966, I divorced Malcolm and decided I needed a little break from the care and all. And so we continued to see him. The children did, as they were before. And then after I'd been divorced about 1.5 years, I was friends with Shirley, and she and I played a lot of tennis together. And she asked me one day if I would be her witness for her divorce. I didn't know she was getting a divorce. So I said I would, and then when I heard all about it, I didn't see much reason for getting a divorce, but she did. And then after that, Don decided to ask me out and see what I'd said to the attorney, or if I'd said anything about what I thought about it. So after that, we dated a little bit, and then we're married that November. And so he had 3 children, of course, and they stayed with Shirley in Atlanta, but then David came down and lived with us. And of course, I had my children to raise. Daryl was about 5 at the time. Don had the Page Insurance Agency, and so his companies, a couple of his companies started giving trips for people who sold a lot of insurance. And so every year, one company would send us to an island one year, and the next year another company would send us to Europe. So we went to all kinds of places. We went to Hawaii, we went to Bermuda, we went to all kinds of wonderful places, and then in Europe, just all over, a whole lot of places in Europe that were very interesting. We had a great time doing that. And by that time, I think the children were in college, or if not, they had family. My mother and Malcolm's mother would take care of them. So I've always loved music. And I took piano many, many years. Went to a lady from our church taught, and I used to leave school at lunchtime. We always had an hour for lunch. And I would go ride my bicycle out to her house and have my piano lesson and come back to the school again. So I learned mostly classical music and things like that. And then later, when we were going to the mountains, I got a mountain dulcimer and learned how to play it one time when I went to a workshop. And then there was a group in Black Mountain that played, and one time they asked me if I'd like to play with them, so I did. I didn't know too much about it, but I learned to play it, learned to accompany. And we had a wonderful time. I played with this wonderful mountain group for 10 years every summer when I was there. Just music I never heard in my life before, but it was wonderful music, mountain music. My Aunt Bess, my mother's sister, she and my mother were very, very close. I grew up with her all the time. She was in Sarasota. We always go down there for holidays. We'd always spend our vacations in the summer with them in the mountains, she and her husband. She was a marvelous artist. She was like a second mother to me. But she was such a good artist. I have a lot of her paintings now, and they're just beautiful paintings. And I used to take some classes from her when she moved to DeLand later. And of course, I would play tennis first. I'd be late for the art classes, but I did enjoy learning what I did from her and taking some lessons later. Anyway, so the Black Mountain College was a very important part of the history of that area in North Carolina. And she built a house in Black Mountain in the early 50s. That was when the Black Mountain College was there, and she went to Black Mountain every summer. We would go up and spend a little bit of time with her while she was there. And then later on, I ended up with that house, that cottage, and it became a very busy place. It was on the way up to the Y, as I mentioned before. And so I ended up selling it, and then I did buy the house we're in right now. And but we have such a nice time in Black Mountain. The people are very friendly, very loving. Everybody is very, very, very nice to everybody else. And while we were there, Don had become a Kiwanian while we were there, and I joined it last year. And we work in the Kiwanis thrift shop, volunteer there one morning or afternoon a week while we're there. They're very nice people, and we have feel very good about doing that because it helps the community. They give the community more than $100,000 every year in scholarships or help for the poor and so on. When I was in school, probably in elementary school, I was extremely shy. My face would turn red if I was called on to answer something, and I just was very shy. And so after a while, my mother said to me, "Barbara," she said, "I want you to start speaking to everybody." I said, "Everybody?" She said, "Everybody." So I thought, oh gosh. So I started doing that. I found everybody likes to be spoken to. It really means a lot to them. And I found that the more I did that, the more people liked it and liked me, really. And when I was a senior in high school in our annual, I was chosen the friendliest girl in the school, which was a big change from being somebody who never spoke to anybody before. So I thought her advice was wonderful. And also, we didn't have much money at all. My father had an alcoholic problem. And in fact, sometimes I would find his bottle and empty it because I didn't like what was going on. But I guess it was because he'd been in 2 wars, and it was very hard on him. So as a result of my father being an alcoholic and spending a lot of money on alcohol, and my mother just being a secretary, we didn't have much money. So even if I spilled a cup of milk on the table, if I wanted milk, I licked it up off the table. We had so little money. So I learned to be very frugal. I learned to be that you don't need to spend money to enjoy life. It's not important at all. You just, it's really how you act and how you live, and how you love people. It's really love that matters very much. I remember one day in Black Mountain, I was driving into a shopping center, and I was feeling rather blue or rather glum, and this girl passed me, smiled in her talk as she went by, and I thought, gosh, that makes a difference. So as a result, today I speak to everybody I see. One of my main goals when the black people were being not segregated anymore, I started speaking to every one of them so they'd feel better, so they'd feel like somebody cared. And also, when I know living with Malcolm, that handicapped people are ignored by most people. So I began speaking to every handicapped person, going up to them and making sure they felt important. I felt that really was important in life, to do that, those 2 things, to help other people. Don is very good about telling me every day that he loves me, and he tells me how wonderful I am and so on. And so it makes me feel loved by him, and so that's so important. So it's very important you do that in your lives, to make the people around you know that you care. It really is, it means a lot to them. When I married Don, I began playing golf. My mother had played golf. She was a wonderful golfer. Also very good at bridge. She played a lot of bridge. We used to do that, but I haven't done it for a long time. But so I began playing golf with him and enjoyed it very much, joining women's groups and playing with them and going to different clubs. It was very nice to do that. I enjoyed that. In fact, he had never had a hole-in-one, and I had mine just before he did. So he didn't like that too well, but I did. Well, I think I always tell Don that I love God most, the best. I mean, I love him, and I love my children, and music. I always cared so much about music. Music is very important in my life. I love it, and I think that's one of the important things, maybe far more than sports. I'm very proud of my 4 children. Debbie has done very well. She and Randy in their insurance business with Allstate. They have 3 delightful children, Jessica and Anita and Jason. And Jennifer lives in Auburn, Alabama, and her husband teaches at Auburn University. And she teaches tennis quite a bit and is involved in a lot of church work. And then Drew Ann lives in Anderson, South Carolina, and she has done a good job of raising her children. Kyle has already graduated from law school and is a lawyer with a high-powered group in Jackson, Mississippi. And Trevor graduates this May, in 1912, from law school in Jacksonville. So he'll be going to her firm to work in Anderson. And then they're also helping Travis get through law school, and he'll graduate next year. The boy that lives with them, had lived with them for a while. Cover them all. And then Daryl lives in Atlanta with his family and with his wife Debbie. She has a good insurance company. He's worked with IBM for many years, done very well, and goes to Charlotte each week from Anderson. Very often calls me when he's on his way to Charlotte. And they have raised some very nice children, twins. Bryce, who was married last January to Kelsey, a very nice young woman, and Nikki, who's in school to be a practicing assistant to an attorney, to a doctor, and she's working very hard and doing very well. And little Rachel, who's into all kinds of sports, soccer and volleyball and things. Very nice family and wonderful around all of them. I love them all. Thank you. And so with all my wonderful family, I love every one of you, and it's been a joy to be around you and to see you grow up and to be your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandmother. So thank you for listening and for being a wonderful part of our family.